3 years and 7 months. That is how long it took Elizabeth Packard to get in front of a jury. 3 years and 7 months, to the day. Her husband had her taken out of their house in Manteno, Illinois, on the 18th of June, 1860. 12 men delivered a verdict on her sanity on the 18th of January, 1864. The jury needed 7 minutes. I want you to hold those two numbers next to each other, because everything in this story lives in the gap between them. 3 years and 7 months of confinement on one side, 7 minutes of deliberation on the other. 12 men, in a courthouse in Kankakee County, in the middle of an Illinois winter, listened to 5 days of testimony about whether this woman had lost her mind. And then they went out, and they came back, and the foreman, a man named John Stiles, read out a single sentence. We, the undersigned, jurors in the case of Mrs. Elizabeth P.W. Packard, alleged to be insane, having heard the evidence in the case, are satisfied that said Elizabeth P.W. Packard is sane. 7 minutes. Now here is the part that most people get wrong when they hear this story for the first time. They assume something went badly wrong. They assume a mistake was made, or a document was forged, or somebody lied to a judge. None of that happened. Her husband did not break any law when he had her committed. He did not need to bribe anybody. He did not need to produce a single piece of evidence. He did not need a hearing, or a doctor's certificate that would satisfy a court, or her consent, or anybody's consent but his own. He needed one signature, his. That was the law in the state of Illinois in 1860, and it was written down, and it was on the books, and any man in that state could read it. It is Section 10 of an act passed by the Illinois General Assembly in 1851, an act setting out the rules for the state hospital for the insane at Jacksonville. And Section 10 said something that I am going to keep coming back to for the next 2 hours, because it is the engine of this entire story. It said that married women and infants could be received into the hospital at the request of the husband, or of the guardian, and it said that this could be done, and I am quoting, without the evidence of insanity required in other cases. Without the evidence of insanity required in other cases. Read that once more, slowly, because the cruelty of it is in the small print. It does not say that wives could be committed without evidence. It says something narrower and far worse. It says that there was a standard of evidence, a real one, a legal one, and it applied to other cases, and it did not apply to wives. If you were a man in Illinois in 1860 and your family wanted you locked away, you got a process. If you were a married woman, you got your husband's opinion. Illinois had built 2 doors into the same building. One had a lock on it, one did not. Elizabeth Packard walked through the second door on a Monday morning in June, in front of her 6 children, and she did not walk back out for 3 years. And I want to be exact about what she had done to deserve it, because this is where the story either grips you or it does not. She had not harmed anyone. She had not been accused of harming anyone. There was no violence, no crime, no accusation of theft or scandal or infidelity. Nobody in this story ever claimed that Elizabeth Packard hurt a living soul. What she had done was disagree with her husband about religion, out loud, in front of his congregation. Her husband was the Reverend Theophilus Packard, and he was a Calvinist minister of the old New England school, and he had been preaching total depravity for decades. Elizabeth had stopped believing it, and in the spring of 1860 she had started saying so in the adult Bible class at the church in Manteno, in front of the people who sat in his pews on Sunday. That is the whole offense. That is the sum total of it. A minister's wife raised her hand in a Bible class and said she did not agree. 6 weeks later, a doctor came to her house pretending to be a sewing machine salesman. Now, I am going to tell you the whole of this, and I am going to tell it in order, and I want to be honest with you at the start about what kind of story it is. It is not a mystery. There is no whodunit here. Every important fact in this case is documented, and most of it is documented several times over, because Elizabeth Packard turned out to be one of the most relentless writers of her century. She published the trial record herself. She published her husband's own words. She published the testimony of the witnesses who called her mad, verbatim, with their names attached. And then she toured the country reading it out loud. So this is not a story about what happened. We know what happened. This is a story about how it was allowed to happen. And it is a story about what one woman did after she got out, which is the part almost nobody knows, and which is, in my opinion, the most extraordinary thing in the entire record. Because she did not simply win her case and go home. She could not go home. When the jury freed her on the 18th of January, 1864, her husband had already rented out their house, sold her furniture, taken her money and her clothes and her children, and left the state. She won, and she had nothing, and so she sat down and she started writing laws. Not petitions, not letters to the newspaper, though she wrote plenty of those. Laws. Actual statutory language, drafted by a woman who had no legal training, no money, no property, no vote, and no legal existence, separate from the man who had put her in the asylum. She carried those drafts into state capitol buildings, and she stood in front of committees of men, and she asked them to change the rules. Before she was finished, she had appeared before the legislatures of 43 states. That is the story. 3 years and 7 months, 7 minutes, and then a woman with nothing walking into 43 state houses with a bill in her hand. If that is the kind of story you want more of, the subscribe button is right there, and it costs you nothing, and it genuinely does decide whether the next one gets made. Now, let us start with Section 10, because until you understand exactly what that law said, and exactly what it did not say, none of the rest of this will land properly. The Illinois State Hospital for the Insane opened its doors at Jacksonville in 1851, and like every asylum built in America in that generation, it opened with a set of rules attached. The rules were written into an act of the General Assembly. Most of that act is dull, and it is dull in the way that public administration is always dull. It deals with trustees and appropriations, and the appointment of a medical superintendent, and the keeping of records. And then you reach Section 10. Section 10 is short. It is one of the shortest provisions in the whole statute, and what it does is create a category of person who can be admitted to a state institution and held there without the ordinary showing that anybody else would have to make. Married women and infants. Those two words sitting side by side in a statute tell you almost everything about the legal position of a wife in Illinois. In 1860, she was placed, in law, in the same bracket as a child. A child could be committed on the word of a guardian. A wife could be committed on the word of a husband. The reasoning was identical, because the legal theory underneath it was identical. Neither one was a fully separate person before the law. The doctrine that made this possible had a name: Coverture. Under Coverture, when a woman married, her legal identity was folded into her husband's. She could not, in most circumstances, own property in her own right. She could not sign a contract in her own name. She could not sue because she had no standing to sue. She could not be sued because there was nobody there to sue. Her earnings, if she had any, were his. Her furniture was his. Her clothes, in the strict legal sense, were his. And her children were his, absolutely, in the event of any dispute. Elizabeth Packard was, at law, covered. That is the actual word the lawyers used. She was a femme covert, a covered woman, and the thing that covered her was her husband. So when we say that Theophilus Packard could have his wife committed with a signature, we are not describing a loophole. We are describing the system working exactly as designed. He was not evading the law, he was using it. And here is the detail that I think is the single most damning fact in the whole statute, and it is the reason I keep saying read the words carefully. Without the evidence of insanity required in other cases, Illinois knew what evidence looked like. Illinois had a standard. Illinois applied it to men. In other cases, meaning the cases of men, and of unmarried women, and of widows, there was a process to go through, and there were people to satisfy, and there was a record. The state had thought carefully about how easy it should be to take a citizen's liberty away, and it had decided that it should not be very easy at all. And then it had carved out an exception, and the exception was wives. I want to be careful here, because this is the point where popular retellings of this story tend to overreach, and I would rather give you the harder truth than the better line. Some accounts say the statute required literally nothing at all. That is not quite right. The provision does refer to the judgment of the medical superintendent. In principle, a superintendent could refuse an admission. But look at what that actually meant on the ground. The husband made the request. The superintendent made a judgment. There was no hearing. There was no notice to the woman. There was no opportunity for her to speak, or to bring a witness, or to be examined by a doctor of her own choosing. There was no court, no jury, no judge, and no record that she could ever have obtained or challenged. The entire proceeding, if you can call it a proceeding, took place between two men, and the second man had every professional and financial reason to accept the first man's account. That is what the law was. A woman's liberty rested on a conversation she was not invited to, and the practical consequence of it is something I want to state very plainly, because it is easy to miss. There was no version of events in which Elizabeth Packard could have argued her way out at the start. There was nobody to argue with. There was no room she could have walked into. The law had not simply set the bar low. The law had removed the room. Now, we do not know how many women went through that door in Illinois between 1851 and 1867, and I am not going to pretend to you that we do. Asylum admission records from that period are incomplete, and the categories used are inconsistent, and the honest answer is that the number is not recoverable. What we can say is that Elizabeth Packard herself, once she was inside, began collecting accounts from other women in the wards, and that she came out convinced she was very far from the only one. She was writing that down while she was still in there. We will come to how. But before we get to the asylum, we have to get to the house in Manteno, and to the 6 weeks, in the spring of 1860, when a marriage that had lasted 21 years came apart over a point of doctrine. Because the other thing people assume about this story, and get wrong, is that Theophilus Packard acted in a sudden rage. He did not. What the record shows is a man who moved carefully and slowly, and who assembled the pieces in the right order over a period of weeks, and who at every stage did the thing that would look most defensible afterwards. He got a doctor to the house. Then he got a second doctor. Then he got the sheriff. And the first doctor did not come to the door as a doctor at all. The Packards had been in Manteno for 3 years. They had come out from New England in 1854 and settled in Illinois, and Theophilus had taken the pulpit of the Presbyterian church in the town. And the family had done what ministers' families did, which was to live in the middle of the congregation with very little privacy and very little money. There were 6 children, Theophilus the Younger, born in 1842, Ira Ware, born in 1844, Samuel Ware, born in 1847, Elizabeth Ware, called Libby, born in 1850, George Hastings, born in 1853, and Arthur Dwight, the baby, born in 1858. So on the morning we are coming to, in June of 1860, the oldest boy was 18, and the youngest was 18 months. Elizabeth was 43. She had been married for 21 years. Her husband was 14 years older than she was, and had been her father's colleague in the ministry before he was her husband. And in the spring of that year, in the adult Bible class attached to his church, she had begun to say out loud that she did not accept the doctrine of total depravity. I will come back to exactly what that argument was, because it matters enormously, and because it is almost always skipped. For now, I only want you to understand its social size. This was not a private difference of opinion between a husband and wife in a kitchen. It was a minister's wife, in the minister's own church, in front of the minister's own congregation, telling them that the central teaching of his theology was wrong. In a small Illinois town in 1860, that was not a theological problem for Theophilus Packard. It was a professional one. And so, in the first week of June, he began to gather medical opinions. The first doctor to be brought to the house was a man named J.W. Brown, and Brown did not arrive announced. He arrived at the door of the Packard house, presenting himself as a sewing machine agent. I want to sit with that for a second, because it is one of those details that sounds too neat to be true. And it is true, and we know it is true, because Brown said so himself, on oath, in a courtroom, 4 years later. He came to the house under a false character. He sat down with Elizabeth Packard, and he talked to her, and she did not know she was being examined, and she talked freely, and what she talked about, among other things, was her husband. She told a stranger, who she believed was selling sewing machines, that she felt dominated in her own home. Brown left, and he wrote up an opinion, and the opinion was that Elizabeth Packard was insane. Now here is where the record becomes genuinely astonishing, and I do not want to characterize it for you, because you do not need me to. In January of 1864, Dr. Brown took the witness stand in Kankakee and was asked to give the grounds on which he had formed that opinion, and he listed them. One of the grounds he gave, and this is his own testimony, was her aversion to the doctrine of the total depravity of mankind. Another of the grounds he gave was that she viewed the subject of religion, in his phrase, from the wrong standpoint. And another, which I have always thought is the most revealing line any witness gave in that trial, was this: she had a great aversion to being called insane. Before I got through the conversation, she exhibited a great dislike to me. Read that as a doctor's clinical finding. The woman objected to being called mad, and she took a dislike to the man who was calling her mad, and both of those reactions were entered on the ledger as symptoms. There is a trap built into that logic, and it is airtight. Calm acceptance proves the diagnosis. Objection proves the diagnosis. There is no answer she could have given in that room that would have counted in her favor. The second doctor was a man named Christopher Nott, and Nott's evidence, when it eventually came, was a good deal more equivocal than Theophilus can have hoped. Nott examined her and formed a view that she was insane on the subject of religion. But he also said, on the stand, one of the most quietly devastating things in the entire transcript. He said that 3/4 of the religious community are insane in the same manner. That is the prosecution's own medical witness, in open court, conceding that whatever he had found in Elizabeth Packard, he could have found in most of the churchgoers in Illinois. With the 2 medical opinions in hand, Theophilus had what Section 10 required. He had made his request. There was a judgment available from the superintendent at Jacksonville. There was nothing left to arrange except the removal itself. He fixed it for a Monday. The 18th of June, 1860, was a Monday. What happened in the Packard house that morning is documented from more than one direction, which is unusual for a domestic scene in 1860. And we have it because both parties eventually told the story in public, and because neighbors testified about it under oath. Elizabeth was not dressed. She was preparing to take a bath. The record is specific about this because she was specific about it afterwards, repeatedly, in print, and because the indignity of it was part of what she wanted people to understand. She was told that she was going to be taken to Jacksonville. She refused. And this is the first thing I want you to notice about Elizabeth Packard, because it recurs at every stage of the next 4 years, and it is the single most consistent feature of her character in the entire record. When she was told to do something she believed to be unjust, she did not comply and then complain afterwards. She made them do it to her physically, in front of witnesses, so that there would be a scene, and so that the scene would be remembered. She would not walk. So the sheriff of Kankakee County came into the house, and she was carried out of her own bedroom, and she was put into a wagon, and she was taken to the railway, and she was put on a train. Her children watched. Theophilus rode with her to Jacksonville and delivered her to the state hospital, and the admission was accepted, and he came home. The whole thing was legal. I want to keep saying that, because the mind resists it. There was no fraud. There was no forged paper. A sheriff, a serving officer of the county, took part in it. And he took part in it correctly, because nothing that was being done was against the law. The law was the instrument. And now consider the position Elizabeth Packard was in at the moment the train pulled out. She had no property because a married woman had none. She had no money of her own. She could not bring a suit because she had no standing to bring one. She could not divorce him, not on any ground realistically available to her in Illinois at that time. And even if she could, the children would have gone to him without argument. She could not write to the outside world except through the institution, and the institution read the mail. She could not appeal to a court, because no court had been involved and none was going to be. There was no lever. That is the thing to hold on to. This was not a difficult situation. It was a sealed one, and the one asset she had left, the only one, was that she was extremely intelligent, and she knew it, and she had decided somewhere on that journey that she was going to keep a record. Now, I want to deal with something here, rather than let it sit unaddressed, because if I were listening to this, I would already be asking it. Was there anything at all in her history that a doctor could have pointed to? There was one thing, and I am going to give it to you straight, rather than have you find it later and wonder why I hid it. In 1835, when she was 19 years old, Elizabeth had been unwell. The illness was described at the time as brain fever, which was a 19th century term covering a range of feverish conditions with delirium, and she spent about 6 weeks at the state hospital in Worcester, Massachusetts. She recovered. She then lived for 25 years, married, ran a household, raised 6 children, taught in the church, and gave nobody any cause to describe her as ill. Theophilus knew about the 1835 episode. It was, in fact, one of the things he pointed to. So let us be fair to the record and put it at its highest for him. A man whose wife had suffered a serious feverish illness with delirium at 19 might, in 1860, genuinely have believed that her sudden change of religious opinion at 43 was a recurrence of it. That is not a ridiculous position for a man of his time and training to hold. I do not think it is the right explanation of his conduct, and I will tell you later exactly why I do not. But I am not going to pretend the argument does not exist. What I will say is this: whether or not Theophilus Packard sincerely believed his wife was ill has no bearing at all on the thing this story is actually about. Because the problem was never his sincerity. The problem was that the state of Illinois had built a system in which his sincerity was the only thing that had to be tested, and there was no mechanism for testing it. A good faith husband and a malicious husband walked through the same door, and the door did not know the difference. She arrived at Jacksonville on the 18th of June. She was 43 years old. The superintendent of the institution was a physician named Andrew McFarland, and he was, at that moment, one of the most respected men in American psychiatry. He would later be elected to the presidency of the National Association of Asylum Superintendents, and within a few years of her release, largely because of what she wrote about him, he would be under investigation by the Illinois legislature. So what did she actually say? This is the part of the story that gets summarized into nothing, and I think that is a mistake, because when you leave it vague, the whole case sounds like a family argument. It was not a family argument. It was a specific theological position, held for specific reasons, argued in specific terms, and it went directly at the foundation of her husband's life's work. Theophilus Packard preached the Calvinism of the old New England congregational tradition, and at the center of that tradition sits a doctrine called total depravity. Total depravity does not mean that people are as wicked as they could possibly be. It means something more absolute than that. It means that the corruption introduced by the fall reaches every part of a human being: the will, the mind, the affections, all of it, so that no person can turn toward God by any capacity of their own. Whatever good a person does is not evidence of any remaining goodness in them. Salvation, on this view, is entirely an act of God upon a creature who has nothing in themselves to contribute. Applied to a household, and this is what matters here, it means that a mother, looking at her own children, is required to understand that those children are, in their nature, wholly corrupt. Elizabeth Packard did not believe it, and what she said in the Bible class was that she did not believe it. She held that the human being carried something of the divine within it. Not that people were not sinful. She was a minister's daughter and a minister's wife, and she was perfectly orthodox about sin. What she rejected was totality. She thought the doctrine of total depravity was a libel on the creature, and she thought that a God who made human beings had put something of himself in them, and that this something was not extinguished. She also, and this is the piece that landed hardest, believed that she was entitled to work this out for herself. She used a phrase, more than once, that appears in the trial record from the mouths of her husband's own witnesses. She said that he had deprived her of her rights of conscience. Rights of conscience. That is not the language of a woman who has lost her reason. That is the language of the American Revolution, and of the Protestant Reformation, and of every dissenting congregation that ever walked out of a church and built its own down the road. It is one of the oldest and most respectable phrases in the whole tradition Theophilus Packard belonged to. And there is something else in the record from that spring, and it is easy to skate past, and I do not think we should. In 1859 and 1860, in Illinois, the country was pulling itself apart over slavery. John Brown had been hanged in December of 1859. Elizabeth Packard held anti-slavery views and expressed them. Her husband's sympathies ran the other way, or at least ran a great deal more cautiously. Her defense of John Brown was among the things that were counted against her. So put the charge sheet together, as it actually stood in June of 1860. She disagreed with her husband about a point of doctrine. She said so in his church. She claimed a right of conscience. She had opinions about the largest political question in the country, and she did not keep them to herself. There is not one item on that list that would have raised an eyebrow if a man had done it. A minister who changed his views on total depravity in 1860 would have been called a liberal, or a heretic, or a Methodist, and he would have been argued with, and possibly he would have lost his pulpit, and that would have been the end of it. The argument would have been conducted in the currency of argument. Because she was a wife, the argument was conducted in the currency of diagnosis. That is the switch, and I want to name it clearly because it is the intellectual heart of this whole case. Her husband did not have to prove her wrong. He had to prove her unwell. And the beauty of the second charge, from his point of view, is that it does not require him to engage with anything she said. He does not have to know whether total depravity is true. He only has to establish that a woman who denies it, in his house, must be out of her senses. Now here is the fact that I think finishes this chapter, and it comes from Elizabeth herself, and it is the sort of thing that only survives because she wrote everything down. Once she was inside Jacksonville, the way out was available to her at almost any point. It was available on one condition. She had to say that she had been wrong, and that her husband had been right, and that her religious opinions had been the product of a diseased mind. She was asked, repeatedly, by doctors, and by attendants, and eventually by the superintendent himself. For 3 years, she declined. You can call that stubbornness if you like. Her husband certainly did. But look at what she was being asked to do. She was being asked to purchase her liberty by testifying against her own mind. She was being asked to agree that the thing she had thought, carefully, over years, was not a thought at all, but a symptom. And she understood, and this is what makes her formidable, that if she said it once, it became true forever, and every word she ever spoke afterwards would carry it. So she stayed, and she began, almost immediately, to write. Andrew McFarland was 43 years old in 1860, the same age as the woman who had just been delivered into his care. He had come to Jacksonville around 1854 from New Hampshire, where he had run the state asylum at Concord. He was a physician of real standing. He wrote for the professional journals. He corresponded with the other superintendents across the country, the small fraternity of men who between them ran almost every public asylum in America. Later in his career, he would be elected president of their association. He was not, in other words, a country doctor with a locked building. He was one of the architects of American psychiatry as a profession, and Jacksonville was one of the showpiece institutions of the Western states. And by every account, including hers, the first meetings between McFarland and Elizabeth Packard went well. She liked him. She said so. She thought, in those first weeks, that she had found the one man in Illinois who would listen to her account of what had happened and recognize immediately that a mistake had been made. He was educated. He was courteous. He was, unlike her husband, not a party to the dispute. She wrote to him. She talked to him. She set out her position with the same organized clarity she had brought to the Bible class. And the thing she wanted from him was very simple. She wanted him to certify that she was sane. He would not. I have thought about why for a long time, and I want to give you the honest range of possibilities rather than the satisfying one. The least generous reading is that McFarland understood exactly what had been done to her and had no institutional interest in saying so. Consider his position. Every admission at Jacksonville under Section 10 had come through a husband. If the superintendent began issuing findings that these women were sane, he was not correcting a single error. He was indicting a category. He was telling the Illinois legislature, and every husband in the state, and every one of his professional colleagues running the same system elsewhere, that the arrangement they had all been operating was a machine for imprisoning inconvenient wives. The more generous reading is that he genuinely could not see it. The diagnostic categories of the period were extraordinarily elastic, and one of them, moral insanity, covered precisely the ground Elizabeth Packard was standing on. Moral insanity described a condition in which the intellect appeared unimpaired, but the moral sense, the affections, the sense of duty had become deranged. A woman who reasoned beautifully, argued in good order, kept herself neat, ran a household, and yet had turned against her husband and her church, fitted that description without any need for malice on the part of the man making the diagnosis. The category was built to catch exactly her, and it had been built by men who had never once had to imagine themselves inside it. There is a third reading, and it is the least dramatic and possibly the truest. She would not concede, and he was not accustomed to being refused. And underneath all three readings sits the same structural fact. Nothing in the arrangement obliged him to be right. Section 10 had delivered her to him without the evidence of insanity required in other cases, and having arrived that way, she had no procedure available to her for leaving that way. The statute had made his opinion the beginning of the matter. The institution now made it the end of it. Whatever the mechanism, the relationship turned. She stopped being a promising patient who would come round. She became a difficult one who would not. And when a patient at Jacksonville became difficult, there was a place for her. The hospital was organized into wards, and the wards were graded. The lower numbers held the patients who were calm, cooperative, and considered close to recovery. Conditions there were tolerable. There were books, there was conversation, there was some measure of dignity. The 8th ward was the other end of that scale. The 8th ward held the patients described in the language of the time as violent and hopelessly insane. It was, in the plain sense of the word, the worst place in the building, and it was where the institution put the people it had given up on and the people it wanted to punish. And the fact that those two groups shared a room tells you a great deal about how the system actually worked. Elizabeth Packard was moved to the 8th ward, and I want to be precise about what that transfer meant, because it is not simply a change of address. In an institution of that kind, ward assignment was the whole of a patient's world. It determined who she ate with, what she was allowed to hold, whether she could go outside, whether she could have paper, how often she was seen by a physician, and, crucially, how her case would be read by anybody who came afterwards. A woman in the 8th ward was, on the face of the record, a woman who had deteriorated. The transfer was therefore not just a punishment, it was evidence. It made the case against her stronger, simply by existing. She had been in Illinois custody for less than a year, and her situation had gone from bad to considerably worse. And there was still no court, no lawyer, no hearing, and no date on which any of this was scheduled to be reviewed. What she did next is the reason we are having this conversation at all. Here is what a day in the 8th ward looked like, as best the record allows us to reconstruct it, and I am going to stay inside what is documented. The women in that ward were, many of them, genuinely and severely unwell. Elizabeth Packard never pretended otherwise, and one of the things I find most impressive about her later writing is that she does not use the other patients as scenery. She names them where she can. She describes them as people with histories and reasons. The ward was dirty. Cleaning was not, in any consistent way, being done. And so, Elizabeth Packard started cleaning it. That sounds like a small thing. It is not a small thing. It is a strategy, and it is one of the most intelligent moves anybody makes in this entire story, and I want to explain why. Think about the position she was in. Every hour of her day was potential evidence. Anything she did could be written into a case note and read back later as a symptom. Anger was a symptom. Weeping was a symptom. Refusing food was a symptom. Insisting on her own sanity was, as Dr. Brown had already demonstrated, a symptom, and there was no external check on any of it. That is the difference between her situation and that of a man in the same building. He had arrived through a process, which meant there was a record of what had been alleged against him and a standard it had been measured against. She had arrived without the evidence of insanity required in other cases, which meant there was nothing on paper for anybody to review, and therefore nothing for anybody to review it against. So she built herself a routine that could not be read that way. She kept regular hours. She attended to her hygiene with what witnesses later described as unusual care. She took physical exercise deliberately and consistently. She cleaned the rooms of a ward full of women that the institution had stopped cleaning. She helped the patients who could not help themselves. Every one of those things is unimpeachable. There is no case note in the world that can turn a woman scrubbing a floor for the benefit of 6 strangers into a proof of derangement. She had worked out that in a place where all behavior was interpreted, the only safe behavior was behavior that could only be interpreted one way. And underneath that routine, she was doing the other thing. She was writing. She wrote constantly, across 3 years. And what she wrote was not a diary in the ordinary sense. It was a case. She recorded what was done to her, and when, and by whom. She recorded conversations. She recorded the names of attendants and the substance of what they said. And then she went further, and this is the part that turns a personal grievance into a piece of history. She began taking statements from the other women. She collected their accounts, how they had come to be there, who had signed for them, what had been done to them since. She was in an Illinois asylum ward in the early 1860s, with no training and no authority and no expectation of ever being believed, conducting an investigation. She understood something about her own situation that most people in her position never work out. She could not win an argument about herself. One woman saying she is sane is exactly what an insane woman would say. It is a closed loop, and it cannot be broken from the inside. But a woman who walks out carrying the documented experiences of dozens of other women is not making a claim about her own mind at all. She is making a claim about an institution, and claims about institutions can be tested. She was building the thing that would eventually be published as The Prisoner's Hidden Life, and the substance of it was assembled inside the building it was written about. Now, how she preserved those papers is a question I get asked whenever I tell this story, and I want to be straight with you, because there are several colorful versions in circulation, and the documentary basis for them is thinner than you would like. What we can say with confidence is that the writing was done, that the institution's staff were aware she was writing, that mail in and out of an asylum passed through the superintendent's office as a matter of routine, and that a substantial body of manuscript came out of Jacksonville with her. The precise mechanics of how it survived, and which parts left in her hands, and which parts left by other routes, are not something the sources let us state cleanly. So I am not going to invent it for you. What matters is the fact of it. She went in with nothing, and she came out with a manuscript. And when the moment finally came to leave, in the summer of 1863, something happened that I think tells you more about Elizabeth Packard than any other single incident in her life. She did not want to go yet. The book was not finished. I want to stay in that ward a little longer, because there is something in what she collected there that changes the meaning of everything that comes after, and it is the part of her story that gets left out of every short version. Elizabeth Packard was not the only wife in that building. That is the finding. That is what 3 years of taking statements produced. She went in believing that a monstrous thing had been done to her, personally, by her husband. She came out understanding that a routine thing had been done to a great many women, procedurally, by a state. The women she talked to had arrived by the same door she had. A husband had made a request. There had been no hearing. Some of them had been there a very long time, and the reasons, as they described them to her, were not medical reasons. They were domestic ones. A woman who would not stop arguing. A woman who had property her husband wanted control of. A woman who had objected to a second household somewhere else. A woman whose religion had become inconvenient, which was her own case exactly. A woman who was simply, in the judgment of the man she had married, too much. Now, I have to be careful with this, and I want to tell you why rather than glide past it. These accounts come to us through Elizabeth Packard. She gathered them, she selected them, she wrote them up, and she published them years later in a book with a campaigning purpose. We do not have independent verification of most of them. We cannot cross-examine the women who gave them. Some of the people in that ward were, without question, seriously unwell, and a seriously unwell person's account of why they are in hospital is not automatically reliable. All of that is true, and anybody who tells you this story without saying it is selling you something. Here is what survives that caution. The statute existed. That is not her testimony. That is the public law of Illinois. The statute created a class of admission that required no evidence. A door of that kind, standing open for 9 years in a state of 1.5 million people, does not get used once. It is not possible that Elizabeth Packard was the only woman in Illinois whose husband found her inconvenient between 1851 and 1860. The law guaranteed that there were others. She simply went and found them, and every one of them had come in through the same clause, not a corrupt clause, not a secret one, a published provision of the Illinois statute book that said married women could be received without the evidence of insanity required in other cases, and which any legislator in Springfield could have read at any point in the preceding 9 years, and which none of them had thought worth a second look. And there is something else in this that I think is the real reason she never gave up over the next 3 decades, and it has to do with what she saw the confinement do to people over time. She watched women arrive who were not unwell, and she watched what a locked ward does to a person who is not unwell. Consider the position. You are told you are mad by everybody you speak to. Your protests are recorded as agitation. Your grief is recorded as instability. You have no calendar and no release date, and no procedure to appeal to, and no one on the outside who is permitted to hear from you unedited. Years pass. Some of them broke. That is the thing she saw. Some women who went insane did not stay sane, and by the time anybody might have reviewed their case, there was nothing left to review, because the institution had manufactured the very condition it had asserted at the start. That is why she came out and immediately went after the postal rules, which sounds like the driest possible reform until you understand it from inside. An uncensored letter is not a courtesy. It is the only wire connecting a confined person to a world that can check on them. She had got out through a window with a letter. She spent 30 years trying to make sure that the next woman would not need a window. Her release, when it came, did not come from a doctor, or a court, or the state of Illinois. It came from her eldest son. Theophilus Packard the younger had been 18 years old on the morning his mother was carried out of the house. In 1863, he turned 21, and at 21 he became, in law, an adult man with a legal existence of his own. That is the whole mechanism. A woman of 46 could not act for herself. Her son, the moment he stopped being a minor, could act for her, and there is something almost unbearable in the arithmetic of that. The clock that eventually freed Elizabeth Packard was not a legal clock or a medical one. It was a birthday. She had to wait for a child to grow up. He moved to have her taken out, and the hospital, having held her for 3 years, now found that its position had changed. Because here is the institutional problem McFarland was facing by the middle of 1863. He had a patient who had not deteriorated. She had not become violent. She had not stopped washing or eating or reasoning. She had spent 3 years cleaning a ward, exercising, keeping her hours, and writing in an orderly hand. Whatever a decline looks like, that is not it. But he could not release her as recovered, because to say she had recovered was to invite the question of what exactly she had recovered from. And the only answer available was her opinions, and her opinions had not changed by so much as a comma. So she was discharged as incurable. I want you to appreciate the elegance of that, because it is genuinely a piece of bureaucratic craftsmanship. Incurable does 2 jobs at once. It gets her out of the building, which by that point everybody wanted, and it does so while leaving the original diagnosis entirely intact. She is not sane. She is beyond help. The institution has not been wrong about her for 3 years. It has merely reached the limit of what medicine can do. It is a finding designed to survive her, and it very nearly did, because that word was going to follow her into a courtroom, and it was going to be the strongest card her husband held. Now, Elizabeth Packard's reaction to being told she could go home is, I think, the single most revealing moment in her 3 years inside. She did not want to leave yet. She said so. She wanted more time, because the manuscript was not finished, and because she understood something about her own situation that had by then become entirely clear to her. Inside the asylum, whatever else was true, she was in the presence of the evidence. The other women were there. Their accounts were there. The routines and the wards and the staff were there. The moment she walked out of that building, she would never be allowed back in, and everything she had not yet written down would be gone forever. There was also a colder calculation, and she made it explicitly. She did not believe her husband had given up. She believed that if she went home, she would simply be confined again, by him, in a different building, with nobody watching. She turned out to be right about that within a matter of weeks, but she went. In June of 1863, 3 years, almost to the day, after the sheriff carried her out of her bedroom, Elizabeth Packard left the Illinois State Hospital for the Insane at Jacksonville. She was 46 years old. She had been gone for 3 years. Her youngest child had been 18 months old when she left and was now 4, and had no memory of her at all. The baby she had last seen was a boy who did not know who she was, and she was going back to a house that was no longer, in any meaningful sense, hers. The house Elizabeth Packard came home to in the autumn of 1863 was not the house she had been carried out of. The family had moved. Theophilus had taken them across the state line for a period and then brought them back to Illinois, and the household she walked into was one that had been run for 3 years without her, and had been arranged quite deliberately so that she could not run it now. The most immediate thing she noticed was the locks. There were locks on things that do not normally have locks on them. The pantry, the linen, the stores, her own clothing. The ordinary contents of a household had been placed behind fastenings, and the keys were held by her husband and by a woman named Sarah Rumsey, who had been brought into the house to keep it during Elizabeth's absence, which meant that a 46-year-old woman in her own home could not obtain food or a clean sheet or a change of dress without asking a man's permission and having it granted. I want to slow down here, because this is the passage of the story where people's attention sometimes drifts, and it should not, because this is where the machinery becomes visible in a way that even a locked ward does not manage. An asylum is a building designed to confine people. When it confines someone, it is doing what it was built to do, and there is a kind of grim honesty in that. What Theophilus Packard did in the autumn of 1863 was take an ordinary Illinois farmhouse and convert it, item by item, into the same thing. He did not have to build walls. The walls were already there. He only had to control the openings, and here is the legal position she was in while it was happening, which is the part that makes it more than a domestic cruelty. She could not leave, because she had nowhere to go and no money to get there, and because the money did not exist that was hers. She could not complain to a court, because she had no standing. She could not appeal to the church, because the church was his. She could not take her children, because they were his in law, and she had no counterclaim of any kind. And hanging over all of it was the discharge paper from Jacksonville, with the word incurable on it, which meant that any account she gave of her own treatment came pre-labeled as the testimony of a madwoman. He had not simply confined her. He had confined her inside a set of documents. Now, the neighbors were watching. This is the thing Theophilus appears not to have adequately weighed, and it is the reason the whole arrangement eventually came apart. Manteno was a small town. The Packards were the minister's family. Elizabeth had lived among these people, taught their children in Sunday school, sat in their kitchens, and she had been away for 3 years, and now she was back, and she was not being seen. People noticed that she did not come to the door. They noticed that she was not at church. They noticed that when they called, they were told she was not receiving visitors, and that this was said by her husband on her behalf without her being produced. One of those neighbors was a woman named Sarah Hazlett. Mrs. Hazlett had known Elizabeth before the asylum, and she did not accept the account she was being given, and she kept coming back. She asked to see her. She was refused. She asked again, and at some point in that autumn, Theophilus Packard made the decision that turned a controlling household into a criminal one. He stopped letting his wife out of a room. The room was the nursery. It was on an upper floor. It had a window, and in the late autumn of 1863, Elizabeth Packard was put into that room, and the door was fastened, and she stayed in it for about 6 weeks. We know precisely what was done to the window, because a neighbor later stood up in a courtroom and described it in the kind of detail that only comes from having gone and looked. The window was a sash window, the ordinary kind, 2 frames, one sliding up behind the other. Somebody had driven nails into it from the inside, and then, not satisfied that nails alone would hold, somebody had put 2 screws through the lower part of the upper sash and the upper part of the lower sash, pinning the 2 frames together so that the window could not be raised at all. That is not a man losing his temper. Nails are a temper. Screws through the overlap of 2 sashes are a plan. Somebody stood in that room with a screwdriver and thought about how a determined woman might work nails loose, and solved the problem. The room had no fire. This is Illinois, north of the 40th parallel, going into November and December, prairie winter, nights well below freezing for weeks at a stretch, wind coming across open country with nothing to stop it. A room in an Illinois farmhouse with no fire in December is not cold in the way a cool room is cold. It is a place where water freezes. And she did not have warm clothing, because her clothing was behind one of the locks, for 6 weeks, in a nailed room, without heat, in a prairie winter. I said earlier that I would keep telling you that everything her husband had done up to this point was legal, and I want to mark the moment where that stops being true, because it matters enormously to what happens next. Committing her under Section 10 was lawful, ugly, but lawful. Controlling the household stores was lawful, because they were his property and she had none. Refusing visitors on her behalf was, in the legal universe of coverture, at least arguable. Locking a human being in a room is false imprisonment. Coverture gave a husband enormous power over his wife. It did not, even in 1863, give him the power to imprison her in a room in his house indefinitely. That was the line, and he crossed it, and the moment he crossed it, a court finally had something it could get hold of. Because here is the thing about the writ of habeas corpus. It does not ask whether a person is sane. It does not ask whether a marriage is happy, or a wife is dutiful, or a husband is sincere. It asks one question, and it asks it of whoever is doing the holding. By what authority are you detaining this body? That is all. Produce the person, and state your legal warrant for having them. And Theophilus Packard, standing in his own house in Manteno, with his wife nailed into an upstairs room, had no answer to that question. He had a discharge paper from Jacksonville that said incurable. He did not have a commitment order because she had been discharged. He did not have a court finding because there had never been a court. He had his own opinion, and his own opinion had been sufficient in June of 1860 because Section 10 made it sufficient for admission to a state hospital. Section 10 did not authorize a private citizen to run a private asylum in his own nursery. The law that had been the instrument of her confinement had, at that exact point, run out of reach. He had used it up. But none of that meant anything at all unless somebody on the outside knew she was in that room. Which brings us to what she did with the window she could not open. The sashes were pinned together, but a window is not only a hole, it is also a thing you can see out of and be seen through. And it is a thing you can get a small object past. And Elizabeth Packard had spent 3 years in an institution learning exactly how much can be accomplished with paper. She wrote a letter. We do not know precisely how she got it out. The accounts differ on the mechanics, and I would rather tell you that than pick the most cinematic version and present it as fact. What is not in dispute is the outcome. A letter left that room, and it did not go to a lawyer or a judge or a newspaper or a relative. It went to Sarah Hazlett, the neighbor who had kept knocking, the woman who had refused to accept the answer she was being given at the door. Elizabeth Packard had one message to send, and she spent it on the person who had already demonstrated that she would not let it go. That was the right call. It may have been the best judgment she made in 4 years. Because Mrs. Hazlett did not write back, and she did not agonize, and she did not go and ask the minister whether it was all a misunderstanding. She went and got a judge. The judge was Charles R. Starr of the Kankakee County Court, and what landed on his desk in January of 1864 was a petition on behalf of a woman he had never met. The petition said that Mrs. Elizabeth P.W. Packard was unlawfully restrained of her liberty. It said that she was forcibly confined and imprisoned in a close room by her husband. It said that he refused to permit her to visit her neighbors and refused to permit her neighbors to visit her. Every element of that is a factual allegation about a body in a room. Not a word of it is about religion. Judge Starr issued the writ, and Theophilus Packard, when it was served on him, did the thing that people in his position almost always do, which was to produce his wife and produce his justification at the same time. He brought her to the court, and his answer to the writ was, in substance, that he was not imprisoning a citizen. He was managing an invalid. She was insane. He had a state hospital discharge that said so. He was exercising a husband's proper care over a wife who could not care for herself, which meant that the question in front of Judge Starr was no longer only whether she was restrained. It was whether the restraint was justified, and the justification rested entirely on one fact, and that fact was her mind. So Starr did something that he was not obliged to do, and that changed the whole course of this story. He impaneled a jury, and I want you to feel the size of that given where this story started. In June of 1860, the state of Illinois had taken this woman's liberty on one man's request, without the evidence of insanity required in other cases. In January of 1864, it was about to give her 12. I want to be clear about what that decision meant, because in the mechanics of it lies the reason this case is remembered at all. He could have handled it himself. Judges dealt with habeas applications on their own authority all the time. He could have heard the husband, glanced at the Jacksonville paper with the word incurable on it, taken a view, and disposed of the matter in an afternoon. Nobody would have criticized him. On the face of the documents, the husband had the better of it. Instead, he said, in effect, that if the whole justification for holding this woman is a claim about her sanity, then that claim is going to be tested, publicly, on evidence, in front of 12 men from this county. It is worth pausing on how strange that was. There was no statutory right to a jury trial on the question of a wife's sanity in Illinois in 1864. That right did not exist. Elizabeth Packard would spend the next several years of her life trying to create it. What she got in January 1864 was not a right. It was a judge choosing to give her something the law did not require him to give her. That is worth remembering, because it cuts against the tidy version of this story. The system did not correct itself. One man inside it decided to do more than the system asked of him, and everything else followed from that. The trial opened on the 13th of January, 1864, in the courthouse at Kankakee, and it ran for 5 days. Elizabeth had counsel. 2 lawyers appeared for her, Stephen Moore and John W. Orr, and Moore in particular seems to have understood immediately what kind of case this was going to be. It was not going to be won by proving a negative. You cannot prove that a person is not insane, any more than you can prove that a person is not a witch. The category is built so that every response confirms it. So Moore did not try. What he did instead was far cleverer, and you can see it in the shape of the defense when it comes. He put the accusers on trial. He let the husband's witnesses come forward and say, in their own words, under oath, in public, exactly why they thought this woman was mad. And then he let those words sit there, because Stephen Moore had grasped the thing that Theophilus Packard never grasped, right up to the end. In a Bible class, in a parlor, in a church committee, the accusation that a woman is unbalanced does its work invisibly. Nobody asks you to itemize. You say it with a look and a lowered voice, and everybody nods. A courtroom makes you list them, and the moment you have to say out loud, in front of 12 farmers and shopkeepers from Kankakee County, that the woman is insane because she does not accept total depravity, and because she prefers the Methodists, and because she did not like being called insane, The accusation stops being an atmosphere and becomes a set of sentences that can be examined one at a time. Theophilus Packard walked into that courthouse holding what he must have believed was an unanswerable case. He had two physicians. He had a discharge from a state institution, signed by one of the most eminent alienists in the United States. He had a sister, a brother-in-law, and the family's own hired help, all of whom would testify. He was about to spend 5 days explaining himself, in public, on the record, and the record was going to be printed. The first witnesses were family. That is worth noting on its own, because it tells you how this case had been built. Theophilus Packard did not lead with medicine. He led with the people who had watched his wife day after day, in the house and in the church, and who could speak to the change in her. His sister, Sybil Dole, took the stand. Her husband, Abijah Dole, took the stand. And Sarah Rumsey, the young woman who had been brought into the house to keep it while Elizabeth was at Jacksonville, took the stand. Between them, they described a woman who had become, in their account, wild and excited in her talk, who spoke of spiritual matters in ways they found alarming, who had turned against her husband, and who had withdrawn from the congregation. Sybil Dole testified that her sister-in-law had accused Dr. Packard of depriving her of her rights of conscience. I want you to notice what has just happened there, because it is so quick that it is easy to miss. The complaint has been entered as the symptom. Elizabeth Packard said that her husband was denying her freedom of conscience. His sister repeated that to a jury as evidence that she was out of her mind. The content of the accusation was never addressed. Its existence was the proof. Abijah Dole gave evidence about religious language he had heard her use. He described her saying that she was one of the children of heaven, and that Libby, her daughter, was one of the branches. Now, in isolation, and read out flat in a courtroom by a man who disapproves of you, that sounds strange. Read it in the ordinary vocabulary of 19th century American evangelical Christianity, and it is not strange at all. It is the vine and the branches, from the Gospel of John, which is one of the most quoted images in Protestant devotion. Millions of people said things very like it every Sunday. Sarah Rumsey testified that Mrs. Packard had spoken of having a new revelation and had offered her the position of a chief apostle. Again, in a church culture soaked in that language, among people who spoke daily about being called and about apostles and about revelation, this is a sentence whose meaning depends entirely on the tone in which it was said and the relationship between the two women who said it. And the person reporting it was the young woman who had been installed in Elizabeth Packard's kitchen, holding the keys to Elizabeth Packard's linen during the 3 years Elizabeth Packard was locked in an asylum. But the moment I keep returning to from that first stretch of evidence came from Abijah Dole, and it is the single cleanest statement of the logic of this entire case. He was asked about her leaving the church, and he answered, and I am quoting, "She would not leave the church unless she was insane." Sit with that. It is not an observation. It is a syllogism, and it is a perfectly closed one. A sane woman does not leave this church. She left this church. Therefore, she is not sane. There is no fact in that sentence. There is no behavior being described, no incident, no date, no symptom. There is only a premise about what sane women do, and the premise is doing every bit of the work. And here, I think, is where the strategy of Elizabeth Packard's lawyers begins to pay. Because Stephen Moore did not need to shake that witness. He did not need to catch him out, or trip him up, or force a retraction. He needed the jury to hear that sentence, in a room where it could be heard properly. 12 men were sitting in that courtroom. We know their names because she published them. John Stiles, Daniel G. Bean, F. G. Hutchinson, V. H. Young, G. M. Lyons, Thomas Munsey, H. Hirschberg, Nelson Gervais, William Heyer, George H. Andrews, J. F. Maffitt, Lemuel Milk. These were not physicians or theologians. They were Kankakee County men, farmers, tradesmen, a man of business or two, and every one of them had a wife, or a mother, or sisters, or daughters. Every one of them had sat in a church at some point and heard a woman say something they thought was odd, and they were now being told, on oath, by a respectable man, that a woman who leaves a church must by definition be mad. And remember what this trial actually was, because it is easy to lose in the drama of the testimony. There was no legal requirement anywhere in Illinois that a woman get this hearing. Section 10 had committed her without one, and no statute had ever promised her one afterwards. Everything happening in that courtroom was happening because a single judge had decided to hold a hearing that the law did not oblige him to hold. I do not think Theophilus Packard ever understood what he had put in front of those 12 men. He believed he was presenting evidence of derangement. What he was actually presenting, sentence by sentence, was a demonstration of exactly how little a man needed in order to have his wife taken away. Every witness he called made the case against himself a little clearer. And then he called the doctors, and it got worse. Dr. Christopher Nott was one of the 2 physicians who had examined Elizabeth Packard before her commitment in 1860. He was there to give the professional foundation of the case, and what he gave instead was one of the most extraordinary sentences ever offered by a witness who was supposed to be helping the party that called him. He testified that she was insane on the subject of religion, and then he said this: 3/4 of the religious community are insane in the same manner. Read it again. This is the prosecution's own medical expert, under oath, telling a jury that the condition he has diagnosed in the defendant is present in 3/4 of the church-going population of the region. He may have meant it as a kind of dry professional aside. Doctors did occasionally talk that way about religious enthusiasm in that period. But whatever he intended, look at what he handed the defense. If 3/4 of the religious community share this madness, and those people are walking around free, running farms and businesses and raising children and sitting on juries, then the condition cannot possibly be what justifies locking one woman in an asylum for 3 years. He had, in one sentence, made his own diagnosis worthless as a ground for confinement, and he had done it in front of 12 men who were themselves, statistically, part of the 3/4. Then Dr. J. W. Brown was called. Brown was the sewing machine salesman, and he had to explain that, on the stand, in front of the jury, in 1864, he had to explain that in the spring of 1860, he had gone to a private house under a false character in order to examine a woman who did not know she was being examined. He was then asked for the grounds on which he had concluded she was insane, and he listed them: her aversion to the doctrine of the total depravity of mankind, her viewing the subject of religion from the wrong standpoint, and third, and this is his own testimony, in his own words, she had a great aversion to being called insane. Before I got through the conversation, she exhibited a great dislike to me. I said earlier that this is the trap, and here it is, stated by the man who built it, in open court, believing he is being helpful. She disliked being called mad, so she is mad. She disliked the man who called her mad, so she is mad. Consider what that means for anybody standing where she was standing. There is no conduct available to her that is not a symptom. If she had smiled and agreed, that is the diagnosis confirmed. If she had objected calmly, that is the aversion. If she had objected forcefully, that is the excitement. If she had said nothing at all, that is the withdrawal from society her sister-in-law had already testified about. The category was constructed so that it could not be escaped, and Dr. Brown recited its rules to a jury without appearing to notice what he was reciting. And then there was the third element of the medical case, and it was the heaviest one, and it was not in the room. Andrew McFarland, the superintendent of the Illinois State Hospital for the Insane, had held this woman for 3 years and had discharged her as incurable. That word was on paper, signed by an institution of the state, endorsed by a physician whose professional standing was national. Against that, Elizabeth Packard had a set of neighbors from Manteno. On any ordinary reckoning, that is not a contest. In 1864, the word of a superintendent of a state asylum on the question of a patient's sanity was about as authoritative as evidence got. It was, in effect, the state itself speaking. And this is why the next stretch of the trial is, to my mind, the genuinely remarkable part, and why I think Stephen Moore deserves to be remembered alongside his client. He did not attack McFarland. He could not. McFarland was not a witness he could cross-examine, and attacking an absent expert of that eminence in front of a county jury is a good way to lose. What he did instead was to change the question the jury thought it was answering. The husband's case asked, "What do the experts say about this woman?" Moore's case asked, "What do the people who actually know her say?" He was about to put in the witness box a series of ordinary residents of Manteno, Illinois, who had lived beside Elizabeth Packard, done business with her, sat with her, talked with her. Not one of them had a professional opinion. Every one of them had years of direct observation. And he was going to finish with a man who had done something none of the doctors had ever bothered to do. He had sat down with her and talked for 3 hours. The defense was, on the surface, unimpressive. That was the point. Stephen Moore did not produce a rival expert to fight McFarland on his own ground. He produced Manteno. Joseph E. Labrie was a justice of the peace and a notary. He was a man whose entire professional function was to observe people, take their statements, witness their signatures, and form judgments about whether the person in front of him understood what they were doing. He had known Elizabeth Packard, and what he told the court was as plain as it is possible to be. I always said she was a sane woman, and say so yet. Not. I saw no evidence of insanity. Not, in my limited observation. He had held a view before all of this began. He had held it publicly, and he was not moving off it now that it had become inconvenient to hold. Daniel Beatty, a neighbor, testified in the same register. She always appeared to me like a sane woman. Dr. J.D. Mann examined her and reported to the court. I could find nothing that indicated insanity. And Sarah Hazlett, the woman who had kept knocking, gave 2 pieces of evidence, and they did different work. The first was the plain one. I never saw any signs of insanity with her. The second was the window, because Mrs. Hazlett had gone and looked, and she described to the court what she had seen: the nails driven in from the inside, the 2 screws passing through the lower part of the upper sash and the upper part of the lower sash. That is the moment the case changes character, and I want to explain why, because it is a piece of advocacy worth admiring. Everything up to that point had been about the interior of a woman's mind. Was she excited, or was she animated? Was her religious language deranged, or was it ordinary devotion? Was her dislike of Dr. Brown a symptom, or the entirely reasonable response of a woman being examined under false pretenses? All of that is contestable. All of it depends on who you find credible. 2 screws through a window sash are not contestable. They are a physical object. They exist or they do not. They were put there by somebody for a purpose, and there is only one purpose they could possibly have had, and no amount of theological argument or medical opinion changes what a screw through a sash is for. Moore had given the jury something they could hold, and it did something else as well, which I do not think was accidental. For 4 years, every decision about this woman had been made on the basis of opinions about her mind, given without evidence. Because the statute that started all of it had said that in her case, no evidence was required. Sarah Hazlett had just walked into the room carrying the first hard physical fact anybody had produced since June of 1860, and once the jury was holding it, the entire frame of the case inverted, because the question they had been invited to answer was, is this woman well enough to be at liberty? And the question in front of them now was, what kind of man puts screws through a window sash in a room with no fire, in December, in Illinois, and keeps a woman in there for 6 weeks? There is a piece of testimony from Elizabeth's side that I have not mentioned yet, and it belongs here, because it goes to the same point from a different direction. Nobody who lived near her had seen it. That sounds obvious. It is not. Think about how mental illness of a serious kind actually presents in a small 19th century town. It is not a secret. Neighbors know. The women who share a kitchen wall know. The man who sells you flour knows. The family in the next pew knows. It is visible, and it is talked about, and it leaves a trail through a community. There was no trail. The people who said Elizabeth Packard was insane were, without exception, her husband, her husband's sister, her husband's brother-in-law, the young woman employed in her husband's house, and 2 physicians engaged by her husband. Every single one of them stood inside the same set of interests. The people who said she was sane were the town. Moore let the jury notice that on their own. He did not have to say it. And then he called his last witness, and the last witness was a man who had done something that not one person in the whole of this case had thought to do in 4 years. He had listened to her. Dr. Duncanson was a physician, and he was also a theologian. That combination is the reason he matters, and it is the reason Stephen Moore saved him for last. Because think about what the case had come down to by the end of the 4th day. 2 doctors had said she was insane on the subject of religion. Neither of them had engaged with her religion. Dr. Brown listed her aversion to total depravity as a symptom without ever indicating that he had considered whether her position on total depravity was defensible. Dr. Nott waved at 3/4 of the church-going population without examining a single proposition she actually held. That is the gap in the husband's case, and it is enormous, and nobody had walked into it yet. Every witness who had called her mad on religious grounds had assessed the manner and ignored the content. Duncanson could assess the content, so he went and did the thing. He sat down with Elizabeth Packard, and he talked with her about theology, and about religion, and about the questions she had raised in the Bible class in Manteno, and he did it, by his own account, for 3 hours. 3 hours. Dr. Brown's original examination, the one that produced the finding of hopeless insanity, had been a conversation in a parlor with a woman who thought she was talking to a man selling sewing machines. And then Duncanson came into the courtroom in Kankakee and gave the jury this: she is not only sane, but the most intelligent lady I have talked with in many years. And then, and this is the line that has outlived everybody in the room, he told them how he had reached that view. I do not call people insane because they differ with me. I want to let that sit, because it is not only the best sentence in this trial, it is the whole case, compressed into 9 words, and it is being said by a doctor. Every witness on the other side had, in effect, been saying the opposite. Abijah Dole had said she would not leave the church unless she was insane. Dr. Brown had listed disagreement with a doctrine as a symptom. Sybil Dole had offered her sister-in-law's complaint about freedom of conscience as proof of derangement. The entire structure of the husband's case was that dissent equals disease. And here is a physician and a theologian, a man with standing in exactly the two fields being invoked against her, saying to the jury that this is not how any of it works, that people are allowed to disagree with him. That difference of opinion, including difference of opinion about God, is not a medical event. He was not finished. He said, of Elizabeth Packard, that there is wanting every indication of insanity, not merely that he had not found any, that the indications one would expect were absent. And then he said, the thing that I suspect actually decided the case, because it did something none of the other testimony did. It told 12 men from Kankakee County how they should feel about her. I pronounce her a sane woman, and wish we had a nation of such women. That is not the language of a clinical finding. That is a man taking a side, in public, on the record, and inviting the jury to take it with him. By the time Duncanson stepped down, the shape of the case had been completely reversed. The husband had opened with experts and family and a state hospital discharge. He was closing with a courtroom that had been told, by a doctor, that the woman he had confined was the most intelligent person that doctor had spoken to in years, and that the country would be better off with more of her. And there is a bitter symmetry in that, which I doubt anybody in the room noticed at the time. It had taken 3 hours of conversation with one honest doctor to establish what 4 years of institutional process had failed to establish. 3 hours against 3 years and 7 months. The evidence closed on the 18th of January, 1864. 5 days. Something in the region of 24 witnesses. A state institution on one side and a small Illinois town on the other. Judge Starr sent the jury out, and they were back before anybody had time to leave the room. 7 minutes. 12 men had listened to 5 days of evidence about whether a woman had lost her reason. They had heard 2 physicians for the husband and 2 for the wife. They had heard the family and the hired help and the neighbors and a justice of the peace and a theologian. They had heard about the Bible class and total depravity and the sewing machine salesman and the 8th ward and the nails and the screws. And they needed 7 minutes. I have always thought that number is the most eloquent thing in the entire record, and it is eloquent precisely because it is so short. 7 minutes is not deliberation. 7 minutes is the time it takes 12 men to sit down, agree that there is nothing to discuss, find a piece of paper, and write on it. Somebody had to be chosen to write. Somebody had to sign. There is a floor below which a jury physically cannot go, and they were close to it. They were not weighing the evidence. They had weighed it while they were listening. The foreman was John Stiles, and the verdict he brought back was this: we, the undersigned, jurors in the case of Mrs. Elizabeth P.W. Packard, alleged to be insane, having heard the evidence in the case, are satisfied that said Elizabeth P.W. Packard is sane. Look at how that is constructed, because it is not a lawyer's sentence, and it repays attention. Alleged to be insane, having heard the evidence in the case, are satisfied. They are answering the accusation in its own terms and handing it back. You alleged. We heard. We are satisfied. All 12 signed it. Stiles, Bean, Hutchinson, Young, Lyons, Muncie, Hirschberg, Gervais, Heyer, Andrews, Mayfitt, Milk, and Judge Charles R. Starr made his order the same day, the the 18th of January, 1864. It is hereby ordered that Mrs. Elizabeth P.W. Packard be relieved from all restraint incompatible with her condition as a sane woman. Relieved from all restraint incompatible with her condition as a sane woman. That is a beautifully judged piece of language, and I think Starr chose it carefully. He does not order her husband to do anything specific. He does not name him. He does not use the word imprisonment, or false, or unlawful. He simply declares her condition and then makes every restraint that is inconsistent with that condition unlawful by definition. He is not punishing Theophilus Packard. He is removing the ground from under him. And there is one more thing in that sentence, and it is the thing I want to leave with you before we go on, because it is going to matter for the rest of her life. Restraint incompatible with her condition as a sane woman. A sane woman in Illinois in 1864 was still subject to a very great deal of restraint. She could still not own property. She could still not keep her earnings. She could still not claim her children against their father. She could still not vote, or sit on the jury that had just freed her, or testify in a great many proceedings. The order returned Elizabeth Packard to the legal condition of an ordinary married woman. The court had done everything a court could do. It had established that she was sane. It had established that she could not be held in a room. It had not and could not give her anything back. 3 years and 7 months, 7 minutes. And what she walked out into was not freedom in any sense that a person alive today would recognize. It was the removal of one particular set of nails. Her husband was not in the courtroom to hear the order read. He had left the state. While the trial was running, Theophilus Packard had been busy. He had rented out the house. He had sold the furniture. He had gathered up her clothing, her personal possessions, and what money there was. He had taken the children, and he had gone to Massachusetts. By the time the jury came back and Judge Starr signed his order, there was nothing in Manteno for Elizabeth Packard to be restored to. The court had declared her sane, and the declaration was worth exactly what her legal position allowed it to be worth, which was very little. I want to lay out precisely what she could and could not do on the 19th of January, 1864, because this is the part of the story that people skip to get to the triumph, and skipping it makes the triumph incomprehensible. She could not recover the furniture because it had never been hers. Under coverture, a wife's personal property became her husband's on marriage. He had sold his own furniture. She could not recover the money for the same reason. She could not recover her clothes, and this sounds absurd, and it is absurd, and it was also the law. She could not compel him to support her in any way that was realistically enforceable across a state line, and she could not have her children, and not one of them. The father's right to custody was, in 1864, close to absolute. There was no doctrine yet that put a child's welfare above a father's title. Her 3 youngest were with him in Massachusetts. Arthur, the baby who did not know her, was 5 years old. So here is the accounting of what Elizabeth Packard actually won in that courtroom. She won the right not to be locked in a room. That is the entire prize. A jury of 12 men in Kankakee County certified that she was of sound mind, and the effect of that certification was that no one could physically confine her body. Everything else that a person needs in order to live, money, shelter, clothing, family, legal standing, remained exactly where it had been the day before. 47 years old, publicly certified sane, destitute. And what she did with that, in my view, is the reason this story is worth 2 hours of anyone's life. Because look at the options in front of her. She could have gone home to Massachusetts, to her family, and been quietly absorbed as the unfortunate relative with the terrible history. She could have fought her husband through the courts, which would have cost money she did not have, to pursue rights she did not possess. She could have gone to work, if work could be found for a woman of 47, with the word incurable in her file. She did something else. She looked at what had happened to her, and she identified, correctly, that not one part of it had been an accident. There was no villain to defeat. Her husband had done nothing that the state of Illinois had not expressly permitted him to do. Dr. Brown had done nothing that his profession forbade. McFarland had operated an institution exactly as the statute contemplated. Even the sheriff who carried her out of her bedroom had been executing a perfectly lawful removal. The fault was in the text. It was in one clause of one section of one act, which said that married women could be received without the evidence of insanity required in other cases, and which had done every bit of the damage. And a text can be amended. So Elizabeth Packard, with no money, no property, no vote, no legal standing, and no formal education in the law, sat down and began drafting legislation. She started where she had the most credibility, which was Illinois, and she started with the thing that had happened to her first. Section 10. The provision that let a husband put his wife into a state hospital without the evidence of insanity required in other cases. Her proposal was not radical. That is the striking thing about it. She was not asking for a new right. She was asking that the exception be closed. She wanted married women to get what everybody else already got: a hearing, in public, before somebody who was not the person asking for the commitment, and to pay for the campaign, and to make the argument. She did the only thing available to a woman in her position. She published. The first book came out in 1864, the same year as the trial, and it was called Marital Power, exemplified in Mrs. Packard's trial, and self-defense from the charge of insanity. It is not a memoir. That is the thing people expect, and it is not what she wrote. It is a docket. She printed the petition. She printed the testimony. She printed the witnesses by name, and what each of them said, in their own words, including the ones who called her mad. She printed the verdict and the 12 signatures. She printed Judge Starr's order. Think about the confidence in that. Her husband's entire case, reproduced in full, at her own expense, and distributed by her. She was not asking the reader to take her word against his. She was handing over the transcript and letting Dr. Brown explain, in his own sentences, that a woman's dislike of being called insane was a symptom of insanity. She had worked out that her husband's case was most damaging to him when it was quoted accurately. More books followed. Great Disclosure of Spiritual Wickedness in High Places in 1865, The Mystic Key, or The Asylum Secret Unlocked in 1866, The Prisoner's Hidden Life, or Insane Asylums Unveiled in 1868, which is where the material she gathered in the 8th Ward finally came out, and Modern Persecution, later, which ran to 2 volumes. She sold them herself. She went door to door. She sold them at meetings and after lectures and by subscription. That was the business model of a 19th century reformer without a patron, and she worked it hard, and it is how she ate, and it is how she paid to travel to state capitals. And she went to the capitals. In 1867, 3 years after the trial, the Illinois legislature passed a bill that she had campaigned for, and it is generally known as the Personal Liberty Law. The principle it established is the one she had been denied in June of 1860. A person alleged to be insane was entitled to a public hearing before being committed. The category of married women quietly excused from the ordinary standard of evidence back in 1851, was brought back inside it. Section 10 was finished. I want to be exact about what that meant, because it is the closing of the circle. The clause that had made Elizabeth Packard's confinement possible said that married women could be received without the evidence of insanity required in other cases. The 1867 law deleted the exception. There were no longer other cases, and her case. There was one standard, and it applied to everybody. Massachusetts moved in the same period, and then other states, over the following decades, adopted protections of a similar kind, some requiring a jury, some requiring independent medical examination, some establishing boards to review commitments. By the end of the century, something like 30 states had statutes of that family on their books. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the point where an admiring account tips into a false one. Elizabeth Packard did not personally write 30 statutes. Commitment reform in the later 19th century had many authors, and there were other scandals and other campaigners, and a general shift in legal thinking about due process that was going to happen with or without her. It would be dishonest to hand her the whole of it. What is genuinely hers is this. She was there at the start of it. She was one of the first people in America to frame wrongful commitment as a question of civil liberty rather than of medical judgment. And she was the one who made legislators look at the specific problem of a wife whose confinement rests on nothing but her husband's word. And the scale of her personal effort is not in doubt, because it is documented in the legislative records of the states themselves. She appeared before 43 state legislatures. 43. A woman traveling alone in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and into the 1890s, in an era of unheated trains and difficult roads, carrying a satchel of her own books and a draft bill, into 43 state houses full of men, to ask them to change the law. She was still doing it in 1891, when she was 74 years old, when she went to Indiana with a bill to protect the postal rights of asylum inmates, so that patients could write to the outside world without their letters being read by the institution holding them. She understood exactly why that mattered. She had spent 3 years inside a building where every letter passed through the superintendent's office. The committee heard her, and then it silenced her, and she went straight to the press about it. "I have this morning met by appointment the Senate committee," she wrote, and was there completely gagged, not allowed to speak one word. And then she added the detail that gives you the measure of the woman. Because it is not a complaint about her treatment. It is a data point. She noted that this was the first discourteous treatment she had ever received from any legislative committee. The first, in 43 states, across nearly 30 years. The Indiana bill was gutted in committee and died on its second reading. Indiana passed a reform 4 years later anyway. There was one more thing she built, and it is worth naming because it shows how quickly she moved from her own case to everybody else's. Not long after the trial, she founded what she called the Anti-Insane Asylum Society, an organization whose purpose was to press for the rights of people confined in institutions and for the custody rights of women who had been separated from their children. She was, within a couple of years of walking out of Jacksonville, running a campaign organization, and the children. Theophilus had taken all 6 of them to Massachusetts in 1864. The older boys were grown, or nearly grown, and made their own way. The younger ones grew up with their father, in another state, and their mother had no legal claim on any of them. For 5 years, she had no remedy at all. Then the laws changed. In 1869, in both Illinois and Massachusetts, on the property and custody rights of married women. Theophilus gave the younger children up. He was not compelled to hand them over by a court order in any dramatic scene. What happened is quieter and, I think, more telling. The legal ground on which he had held them simply eroded, and when it was gone, he let them go, and they came to Chicago to live with their mother. She was 52 years old. Arthur, the baby who had been 18 months old on the morning the sheriff came, was 11, and there was one more law, and for her, it may have been the most important of all of them, because it was the one that gave her back the thing the court in Kankakee could not. In 1869, Illinois and Massachusetts both moved on the property and custody rights of married women, and in that same year, Theophilus Packard gave the children back. Now I want to do the thing I always try to do near the end, which is to turn around and test the story I have just told you. Start with Andrew McFarland, because his ending is the one people always want. McFarland remained superintendent at Jacksonville until 1869. In that year, the Illinois legislature investigated the institution. The investigation found deficiencies in care, practices that could not be defended, and instances of neglect. McFarland resigned. He did not leave the field. He opened a private asylum in Jacksonville called Oak Lawn Retreat and ran it for the rest of his working life. He kept his professional standing. He had, after all, been elected president of the Association of Asylum Superintendents. On the 21st of November, 1891, Andrew McFarland died by suicide. And I am going to stop there, deliberately, because I know what the shape of this story wants me to say next, and the evidence does not support saying it. I have seen that death offered as a kind of poetic settling of accounts, as though the man who spent 3 years telling a sane woman she was mad was finally overtaken by his own subject. There is nothing in the record that connects his death to Elizabeth Packard. He died 27 years after the trial. He was 74 years old. I do not know why he did it, and neither does anybody else writing about this case. And inventing a reason would be exactly the kind of thing this story is about. What I will say is that his professional afterlife tells you something real. He was investigated, he resigned, and in August of 2023, the state of Illinois took his name off the mental health center in Jacksonville that had carried it for decades and put hers on it instead. That is not poetry. That is a documented administrative act, and it took 159 years. Now the harder one. Theophilus Packard. I have been fairly relentless about him for 2 hours, and I want to give the counter case its best form, because a documentary that only prosecutes is not worth listening to. Here is the strongest version of his defense. He was a man of 57 in 1860, formed entirely by the theology he preached, in which the doctrines at issue were not opinions, but the difference between salvation and damnation. When his wife rejected total depravity in front of his congregation, he did not experience it as a disagreement. He experienced it as the visible evidence that something had gone wrong inside a person he had known for 21 years, and he had a precedent to reach for. She had been ill at 19, seriously enough to spend 6 weeks in a hospital in Worcester. He knew that. A sudden and total change of religious conviction in middle age, in a woman with that history, could look to a frightened and unimaginative man like the same illness returning. He also did not do it in a corner. He obtained 2 medical opinions. He used a lawful procedure. He delivered her to a state institution run by one of the most respected physicians in the country, and that physician kept her for 3 years and discharged her as incurable, which means that at every stage a professional agreed with him, and he was not, on his own account, acting for gain. There was almost no money in that family to gain. That is the case, put at its highest. Here is why I do not accept it. The sewing machine salesman. A man who sincerely believes his wife is ill sends for a doctor. He does not arrange for a physician to enter the house under a false character in order to examine her without her knowledge. That is not the conduct of a frightened husband seeking help. That is the conduct of a man assembling a file, who understands perfectly well that his wife will be able to give an account of herself if she knows she is being assessed, and who therefore takes care that she should not know. And then there are the nails and the screws. Whatever you think about 1860, by the autumn of 1863, he had a wife who had been discharged from a state hospital and returned home. If he genuinely believed she was dangerously ill, there were things a minister could do. He could have sought a further commitment. He could have brought a doctor. He could have gone to the county. He could have gone to his own church. He nailed a window shut and told the neighbors she was not receiving visitors. Men who believe they are caring for the sick do not generally require that nobody be allowed to look. There is one more thing I want to put honestly on the table, and it concerns Elizabeth rather than her husband. Almost everything we know about the inside of that marriage and about the inside of that asylum comes from her. She wrote the books. She published the trial. She controlled the narrative more completely than almost any 19th century woman managed to, and she was, by any measure, an advocate rather than a neutral witness. So could she have shaded it? Of course she could. Any campaigner might. But notice what she chose to do with her power over the record. She printed her opponents in full. She reproduced Dr. Brown's list. She reproduced Abijah Dole's syllogism. She put Sybil Dole and Sarah Rumsey on the page in their own words and let them stand. A person shading the record does not do that. A person shading the record paraphrases, and on the central factual questions, she does not stand alone. The statute is a public document. The trial happened. The verdict exists with 12 signatures on it. Judge Starr's order exists. Sarah Hazlett described the window under oath in a courtroom where the man who nailed it was represented. The screws were real. Elizabeth Packard died on the 25th of July, 1897, in Chicago. She was 80 years old. She had outlived her husband. She had got her children back and lived with them. She had supported herself for more than 30 years by writing and selling books about the worst thing that ever happened to her, which is a sentence you can read as tragedy or as a career, and I think she would have preferred the second. The Inter-Ocean, one of the Chicago papers, described her in its notice as the reformer of insane asylum methods. That is a decent obituary. It is also, I think, slightly wrong about what she actually did, and it is wrong in the direction that everybody gets wrong, so it is worth correcting at the end. She did not reform asylum methods. She was not principally interested in treatment. She had nothing much to say about what medicine ought to do for people who were genuinely unwell, and she never denied that such people existed. She had lived among them for 3 years in the 8th Ward, and she wrote about them with more respect than the men running the building did. What she was interested in was the door, not what happened inside. Who was permitted to decide that a person went in, and on what evidence, and whether anybody else got to look, because everything that was done to Elizabeth Packard was made possible by a single design choice made in Springfield in 1851 in one short paragraph by men who almost certainly did not think of themselves as doing anything remarkable. They were writing a Hospital Administration Act. They came to the question of admissions, and somebody observed that in the case of married women and children, the ordinary formalities would be inconvenient, and a clause was drafted, and the clause said that these two categories could be received without the evidence of insanity required in other cases. Without the evidence required in other cases. I have said that phrase perhaps a dozen times in the last 2 hours, and I have said it deliberately, because it is the whole story, and it fits in 9 words. Every nail in that nursery window, every hour in the 8th ward, every one of the 3 years and 7 months comes out of it. And here is what I want you to take away from that, because I think it is the reason her story keeps being retold in every generation and always seems to arrive on time. Nobody set out to build this. There is no villain in Springfield in 1851. There is only a small convenience, written into a large statute, that made a certain category of persons slightly easier to deal with. It sat there for 9 years, without anybody thinking about it very much. And then a minister in Manteno had a wife who disagreed with him in public. And he went and read the statute book, and he found that the state had already done the difficult part for him. Elizabeth Packard understood that better than the people who had drafted it. She had been given every reason to hate individuals. Her husband, McFarland, Dr. Brown and his sewing machines, Sybil Dole. She did name them, all of them, at length and in print, but she did not spend the next 30 years chasing them. She spent it going into state houses and asking men to strike out a clause and put a hearing in its place. She understood that the man was replaceable and the paragraph was not. So, the last image. On the 18th of January 1864, in a courthouse in Kankakee County, 12 men came back after 7 minutes and said that Elizabeth Packard was sane. Judge Starr ordered that she be relieved from all restraint incompatible with her condition as a sane woman, and she walked out into a state where she still could not own a chair, keep a dollar she earned, claim her own children, or vote for the men who wrote the laws that had put her away. The court had told her she was sane. It could not tell her she was free. She spent the rest of her life working on the difference. The window in Manteno had 2 screws through the sashes, driven through the lower part of the upper frame and the upper part of the lower frame, so that the 2 halves could not move against each other. They were still there in January when Sarah Hazlett went and looked. That is why we know